In this video, I'm going to show you how to add asynchronous tasks to a Django project using Celery. So what we're going to cover in this tutorial is we're going to cover what are async tasks and when you might use them. We're then going to run an existing project that we have that I've already created before this, and you're going to get that running on your local machine to make sure it works. Then we're going to install Celery on the project. We're going to configure Celery for Django so that we can actually use it in our Django project. We're going to create a new task that we can run in the background. And then finally, we're going to test the task and make sure that it runs. So in order to take this tutorial, you're going to need the following: the starting code, which I'm going to provide. There's also tutorials on how to create the starting code that we're going to use if you were interested in learning that. And you're also going to need Docker and Docker Compose running on your machine. The easiest way to get that is to download and install Docker Desktop. Please also remember to support our channel by liking and subscribing to the channel. And also please check out our website where we have this tutorial in written form, as well as many other resources and courses which you may find useful. So let's start by talking about what are async or asynchronous tasks. It's basically any task that runs in the background of your application. So by run in the background, I mean it runs outside the main thread of the application that is running. So for example, in a web application, the user would continue interacting with the site while the task runs in the background, and then maybe they would see something on the screen which indicates that something is processing. It's very similar to if you've ever uploaded a video to YouTube. Then you upload the video and it then does some processing, which can take anything from a few minutes to an hour depending on the size of the video, and then eventually the video is processed and you can publish it to your channel. So that thing that's happening is an asynchronous task that's running in the background where YouTube is processing your video. Another good example is when you're interacting with an AI chatbot. Sometimes it will take some time to think about what it's doing, and that's usually happening in the background. So when should you use asynchronous tasks in your project? Well, I like to use them for any requests that are likely to take more than a couple of seconds to run, because you don't really want the user waiting for the browser to load during that time. So for example, if the user performs some kind of action, like a search on your website, for example, if they were to have to wait 5 minutes while the browser says it's loading and the spinner's going and everything, then the chances are they're going to just assume that the site is broken and they're going to either refresh the page or they're just going to navigate to a different website. I also like to use them when I'm interacting with external services. So this could be something like sending an email, using SendGrid API. And the reason for this is because it allows you to queue the tasks in the background so that if that service goes offline or is unavailable for whatever reason, you can retry them at a later date. So I always find it's better when you're interacting with external services to always do them as an asynchronous task instead of doing them in the main thread of the application. And this also means that if the other site goes down, then, or the service that you're using goes down, it doesn't break your website straight away. Like the users can still continue to use the website or the app or whatever it is they're using without it basically just getting stuck on a loading screen or something like that. Another reason why you might use asynchronous tasks is if you are running some things in batches. For example, if you needed to process data that has been uploaded in a batch, so you needed to go through like 100 CSVs or something like that, then you might want to do that as an asynchronous task so it can happen in batches in a queued-like system. So here's some specific example use cases when I would use asynchronous tasks. So one is making requests to AI APIs. So for example, if you're using the OpenAI API and you need to wait for it to return a response, I will usually do that as an asynchronous task so that it happens in the background, because AI APIs often take up to 30 seconds to respond, sometimes even longer, depending on the request, especially if you're processing images or something like that. So you want to do that in a background task so that you can have the best user experience for your end users. You'll also use it if you're doing something like processing video or audio, because that typically takes quite a long time. And you might use it if you're sending emails, because of the example that I used previously, which is usually you would send emails using an external API like SendGrid or something like that. Okay, so we're going to start by clicking the link that is in the description of the video to take you to the starting project code. Now, this is the code that we created in a series of tutorials where we created a Django project with a React front end and a Postgres database, all using Docker. If you're interested in learning how to do that, then you can go ahead and check out the previous tutorials that we have, which we will also link in the description, where you can learn how to set this all up. However, if you only want to learn how to add Celery to an existing Django project, then you can just keep following this tutorial. So we're going to start by cloning this project. So I'm going to copy the clone URL here, and I'm going to open up my terminal, if I can find it. Open up my terminal window. I'm going to change to my workspace. Type git clone, the URL, and I'm going to call this Django Celery. Okay, so before we get started, I'm just going to talk you through the project. So let's go ahead and open up the project in your code editor. And I'll just talk you through what is in this project already. So we have the backend directory, which is a Django project. That is the backend for our project. We have a front-end directory, which is a React app, which we're not going to be using in this tutorial, but it's useful to know that it's there. And then we have the Docker Compose files and the Docker files here, which essentially allows us to run our Django app in Docker Compose. So we have the front-end service that runs the React front-end, we have the back-end service that runs Django, and we have the database service that runs the Postgres database. And it's all set up and configured to work. So if you open up the terminal and you simply type Docker Compose up, you should find that it starts the project pretty quickly. You might take a bit longer for you if it's the first time running this, because it's going to need to download the images and build the images and so on. But like me, once it's cached, if you run Docker Compose up, it runs pretty quickly. And then you can go back to the browser and you can navigate to localhost /8000/admin. That will take you to the Django admin site, or if you just go to 5173, it will take you to the React app, which, like I said, we're not going to be using in this tutorial, but it is useful to know that it's there. So once you've got the project up and running on your machine, you can then stop the server and we can continue with the next step. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do to our project is we're going to add the Rabbitmq service. So Rabbitmq is a queuing server, which allows you to queue various messages that can be then consumed by a worker task. So essentially, you set up the queue, which is used to store all the messages, and then your application posts new things to the queue, which get added to the queue. And then you have worker tasks that take things off the queue and process them. So that's kind of how Django Celery works. So the first thing we're going to do is add our server. There are different things you can use for this. Some people use Redis. Redis is great. I also use that sometimes. However, I like to use Rabbitmq just because it's the kind of default that Celery likes to use. And I just find it easy to work with. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the code. And the change that we're going to make is to docker compose.yaml. So the first thing we need to do is add a new service here. So below the DB service, which exists here, we're going to add a new service. And of course, with the YAML files, you need to make sure the indentation is correct. So make sure you're indented a level to the DB service here. I'm just going to close this to give us more space. And then we're going to type MQ, which is just short for message queue. And then we're going to give image : and we're going to use the Rabbitmq : 3.13.7 -alpine which is freely available on Docker Hub. And then we're going to type environment : and we're going to pass in hyphen and then all caps Rabbitmq_default_user equals MQ user, and then again Rabbitmq_default_pass equals bunny pass 123. Now these are just temporary credentials that we use for our local development only. Of course, if you were to deploy this, then you would want to configure these as environment variables, and you wouldn't want to hard code them into the project itself because it's not best practice. But because this is just for our local development testing server, and it's not going to be deployed anywhere, we can hard code these values here in the Docker Compose file. Okay, so once that's done, you can save the file, and then we'll just go ahead and commit the changes quickly. Git add.git commit -am added message queue. Okay, so now we'll move on to the next step, which is to install Celery. So Celery is the tool that we're going to be using with Django that manages the queue. That is going to be the service that creates the worker, that pulls things off the message queue, and it's also going to be used to add things to the message queue. So you can check out the documentation, which we'll link to in the description, for the official kind of Django, getting started with Django guide. That has lots of useful information there. They might cover more information than we cover in this video. However, I'm going to talk you through all of it, so there's no need to do that. You can, you'll still know how to set up Celery with a Django app by following this tutorial. So what we need to do is install Celery, which is a Python package that is available on the pip or PyPy package manager. So we can install this in our project by opening up requirements.txt, and we can install it by typing Celery equals 5.4.0, which is the current latest version. And then you save the file, and then we can just go ahead and type docker compose build. This will rebuild our Docker image, which will then reinstall these requirements.txt into the Docker image that we use for the project. While that's going, I'll also show you how to set this up directly on your local machine, which is optional. However, it does give you the kind of IntelliSense features of Visual Studio Code. So if you were to open up the terminal, and then while that's running, we can just open a separate window. We're going to create a Python virtual environment, python-m venv env, and then hit enter. And then we're going to type source env/bin/activate, and then we'll type pip install -r requirements.txt. Now this is optional. This just installs the dependencies directly on your machine, and it's useful if you want to have, as I mentioned, the IntelliSense features built into the Visual Studio Code. You can see here it's detected the new environment, and it says, do you want to use this? We choose yes. And then it should basically use our virtual environment with the dependencies installed in VS Code, so it knows that it has these dependencies available when you're typing things in the code editor. Okay, great. So the next step that we're going to be following is essentially what is documented on the first steps with Django documentation page of the Celery website. So it tells you how to set up the project here. So we're going to go through this in the step-by-step essentially and configure Django for Celery. So let's open up the code editor again. And what we're going to do is we are going to start by opening up the backend and then backend directory here and then the init directory. And we're going to type here from.celery import app as Celery _app, and then _all equals, and then in the brackets here we're going to type Celery _app, and then comma. So this essentially ensures that Celery is imported everywhere that we need it whenever we start our Django app. You see that there's some warnings and errors here, and this is because we need to create this Celery module in our project as a next step. Okay, so next we're going to configure Celery for our Django project. We're essentially going to be following some of the steps in this first steps with Django page, which is available on the official documentation for Celery. It tells you how to set up a Django project for use with Celery. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look for this celery.py example code here, and we're just going to copy the contents of this here. And essentially what this does is, as it describes here, essentially what this does is it ensures that the Celery module is loaded and available when Django starts so that you can use this shared task decorator. The shared task decorator is what you use to initialize tasks that can be used in the asynchronous queue. So basically you just need to copy the contents of this, open up the project, and then go into the backend/backend directory, create a new file here called celery.py, and then paste in the contents. And essentially that's all we need to do. It has a debug task here. And part of what this also does is it loads in the configuration value from the configured Django's settings module. So we do need to make a couple of changes here. So we need to change this proj here, which is the example name of the project they use in the Celery documentation, to backend, and the same here, because our Django project is called backend. So this ensures that the settings can be loaded for the correct project. Basically, it looks inside the settings.py file, which we have here, and this is the standard settings file for a Django project, and it pulls in all of the variables that are prefixed by Celery. So we're going to be adding one of those later on, but essentially this code here ensures that Celery can be used with our project and that it uses the configuration values from our settings.py. Then the next step is to open up this init.py file, and if we go back to the documentation page, you can see here we have the example init.py file here, so we can copy that and paste this in here. And this, again, as it kind of describes in the documentation, it ensures that the app is imported when Django Celery starts so that the shared task can be used in the app. So shared task is something that we're going to be using in a bit, which allows us to essentially initialize tasks in our project. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is configure the broker URL for Celery. So the broker that we're going to be using is Rabbitmq, and it's what we configured in our service here, the MQ service. So essentially we need to configure the other side of it, which is to tell Celery how to connect to this message queue server. The way that we do that is we open up settings.py, and then at the bottom of the file, we're just going to type Celery _broker URL equals os.environ.get, and then the environment name here, Celery _broker URL. Okay, so Celery broker URL here, this pulls in the environment variable called Celery broker URL, and it sets it to the configuration value Celery broker URL. And if the value's not set, it just sets it to none or null essentially. So next we need to add this environment variable to our Docker Compose configuration. So make sure you save the file, head over to dockercompose.yaml, and then find our project, our backend project here, and we're going to add a new environment variable underneath the database variables, and it's going to match the same name that we just gave it. So Celery broker URL equals, and now we need to pass in the URL. So it's AMQP, which is the protocol that's used for the message queue, kind of like HTTP, except this is AMQP. AMQP, which stands for Advanced Message Queue Protocol. Okay, so we have that as our kind of URL prefix, and then colon // and then the username MQ user colon, and then bunny pass 123, which is the password that we use, and then at MQ colon 5672 // Okay, so what does this mean? So as I said, AMQP is the protocol we're using, which is the Advanced Message Queue Protocol. Colon / is just part of the URL, which you're familiar with, like HTTP //. And then we have the username for the server. So this is MQ user. It should match the username we gave the message queue server. And then again, the password after colon. So that's how you specify the username and password. As I mentioned previously, this is just a local development server, so it's okay to hard code it here. However, in a real deployed server, anything that's actually accessible on the internet, you want to make sure that you set these as environment variables so that they're not hard coded into the project. Then you have the @ and that says which server we're going to use. So we're going to use the server called MQ, which is the name of the service that we use. So the Docker Compose networking will set up the network in such a way so that we can access the server running in the MQ service using the host name MQ. And then you have colon, and then you have the port number that it runs on, which is 5672. It's the default port number for the Rabbitmq server. And then we have this // at the end to end the URL. Okay, so make sure you save the file, and that's essentially all we need to do to configure Celery in Django. So let's go ahead and commit that to the project. Configure Celery. Okay, so now that's done, let's move on to the next step, which is to add a worker to our Docker Compose configuration. So essentially, I'm going to show you a diagram here. So essentially, the way that Rabbitmq works is you have your Django app, and then it pushes things to the queue, which essentially adds new entries into the Rabbitmq server, which represent tasks that need to be executed. So you add things to the queue, and then you have one or more worker tasks, which their only job is to pull things off the queue when they detect them and process the code. So that's essentially how it works. So that's how you keep your main thread running while adding things to a queue, and then you have a separate thing in the background that's running that can then process items on the queue. In this diagram, we have an example of one single worker. However, you can have as many workers as you need. So it might be that you have lots of tasks that you want to run consecutively. So you might want to process 10 things at the same time. You can have 10 workers running, which are all pulling items off the queue. The idea is that it's a lot faster to add things to the queue than it is to process them. So you would typically have a lot more workers than you have things adding to the queue. So the application is perhaps running in one process, it's adding things to the queue, and then you've got maybe 10 or more workers that are pulling things off the queue and processing these kind of long running tasks that need to run in the background. What we're going to be adding next is the worker side of this. So we'll do that by going back to our project, opening up docker compose.yaml, and we're going to add another service to our configuration. So this service is essentially going to run our Django app, but instead of running the development server that runs the kind of web server that's used, it's going to run the Celery worker task. So we can actually copy this whole block here for backend, and we can paste it in below the MQ service. It doesn't really matter where it goes. I just like it to be kind of ordered in this way. We're going to change the name from backend to worker, and we're going to leave build context because that's all going to stay the same. It's going to use the same Docker file that we use for our Django project. We don't need the ports because it doesn't run a server that essentially is accessible via a port. All it does is process things from a queue. So we don't need to map the port because it doesn't need to be accessible in that way. We can keep the volume mapped because that's what gets the code for the worker into the worker service. So essentially it's still our Django code that's going to run. It's just going to run it as a worker instead of running it as a web server. We don't need the same command here. So we're going to change this. We're going to delete everything except for this kind of sh-c. Remember to add your double quotes here. And then inside the double quotes, we're going to change this for the command that runs the Celery worker task. So it's going to run the Celery worker instead of running the Django server and doing the migrations and stuff. So we'll do Celery -a capital backend and then worker and then -l and then info. So this essentially runs the command Celery, which is the Celery command for starting the Celery worker service. -a specifies the app that we wish to run, which is the backend app. So it looks for the backend directory to run our app. And then the name that we're going to give it, which is worker. So we're going to call this worker. And then the -l is the log level. So this is the level of logs that we want to output. You can set this to info, which is kind of the recommended one. But if you're developing and you need to debug things, you could also set this to debug. So I'm going to leave it as info, but just know that you can change it to debug, which gives you more information in the log output. So it's useful for debugging issues and so on. Okay, then we need the environment variables. They're all going to be exactly the same because again, this is just a Django project. It's just running in Celery. And then we can change this depends on here. So instead of depends on DB, we can delete that and we type depends on -backend and -mq. It does depend on our database as well. However, because we specified depends on backend, it will wait for backend to start, which won't start until the database has already started. So if the database has started, then we can assume that the database was also started. Okay, now that's done, let's save the file and let's go ahead and commit the changes to Git. So git add, git commit -am added worker. Okay, so now we've set that up. The next step is to create a task and actually test it. And I'll show you how you run tasks in the project. So we're going to create a very simple task, and you can create tasks kind of anywhere in the project. I like to create them in the core app because usually tasks are used for multiple different apps that you might add. This is just where I'm going to create it. You can obviously create it wherever you want. I'm going to create a new module here called tasks.py, and this is going to contain our tasks. So what I'll do is I'll start by doing from Celery import shared_task. So I'm getting a warning here because I need to specify my Python interpreter, which I haven't configured. You may or may not get this. I'm going to just try and set this here to the virtual environment that I created, that I installed Celery to. There you go. So the way that I did that is Command Shift P, and then select interpreter, you can type in select interpreter. You obviously have to have the Python add-on installed in order for that to work. But essentially it just gets rid of that IntelliSense error that I had by using our virtual environment where I installed the dependencies. Okay, so now that I've installed the shared task decorator, I'm going to type a task called def hello underscore task, and it's going to accept one parameter called name. And this is just a classic Django function. So this is where you would execute the code for the task. So I'm not actually going to execute anything interesting. I'm just going to type print and then a formatted string literal here, hello, name, and we'll just do a little bit of code here. So we'll do you have, and then len name, characters in your name. Okay, so not a very exciting task, but it does something. And essentially this is where you would run the task or run the code that executes the kind of long running process. So this will obviously return instantly just for demo purposes. However, this task would be what actually runs the processing, or maybe it makes a request to the backend AI API that you're using, or maybe it processes video or does something that would typically take quite a long time to run. So then we need to add the shared task decorator above this. So we type at shared underscore task, and this tells Celery to configure this as a background task. So it means we can call this function in such a way that instead of it getting executed right away, it gets added to the backend queue and then it gets processed by the worker task. Okay, so now that's done, I'm going to show you how to actually run this task and how you would use it in your app. So go ahead and open up your terminal. If the server's already running, then stop the server because you're going to need to restart it because we made changes to our Docker Compose file. So just type Docker Compose build just to make sure everything's rebuilt. It should run pretty quickly as we haven't changed too much, but obviously if you're running it for the first time, it may take some time. Then type Docker Compose up. This is going to pull our message queue service or the image for the message queue service down from Docker Hub, and then it's going to start our new app configuration. Hopefully, if everything was typed and copied and pasted correctly, it should start, and you can see here that it's output some logs for the worker task. So we have our backend task that's running within HTTP, so we can access that. And then we have the MQ, which is the message queue server that's running in the background. It has some warnings here from their Docker image. So they're upstream issues that they probably need to sort out in their message queue server. And then you have the worker task here. So you can see it says Celery ready. And essentially this means that we're ready to go ahead and create background tasks. So the way that you create tasks is you call from our Django project, you call our function, for example, hello task, but you call it in a slightly different way as you would be used to calling it. So let's demonstrate this by opening up the shell for our Django project. So I'm going to make this kind of half and half because it's useful to see the worker queue output as we demo this. I'm going to create a new tab in my terminal. You'll obviously use your PowerShell or whatever you use on Windows. And I'm going to type here Docker compose run -rm and then backend and then sh-c-python manage.py shell. So this essentially creates an interactive Python shell in our Django project that we can use to interact with our project code. So you see here, you've got the interactive shell here. We're going to start by typing from core, which is the app that we put the task in, import tasks. So this imports our tasks module. And then what we can do is type tasks.hello_task, and then let's give our name here. So this is our name. And you obviously put your name if you like. And if you run this, you can see it just runs the function as you would expect. So it's a normal Python function. So this isn't actually using the queue at this point. I'm just demonstrating that this function is just like any other function that you would use in the Django project, and you can call it just like any other function and it will run the code and it will output whatever the output is to the screen. What you can also do, you can type tasks.hello_task.delay and then pass in the parameter mark. And what you'll see is when you hit enter, it doesn't actually run or output the result here. Instead, it gives you an async result and it outputs the output here in the worker. So essentially you can access this .delay here because of the shared task decorator that we added to this function. And when you do that, when you put delay, essentially it will, instead of running the code, if I can go back to my terminal, instead of running the code directly, it will add a new entry to the message queue, and then the Celery worker will pick up that message in the queue and it will execute the code in the worker task. So the .delay will always be a very quick response. You'll get basically an instant response because all it does is add a new item to the queue, and then the execution of that task happens in the background. So essentially, anywhere in your code where you needed to trigger a task, hypothetically, let's say you have a task here that says retrieve or make a request to AI and put the result in the database. You define that as a task, you put the code that does that, all the code that makes the request to the AI API, and then sets the result in a database model, for example. You would set this here, and then in the view that is triggering that code. So for example, maybe the user pushes a button and it makes a request, a HTTP post request or something like that. In the view code, you would use this .delay. So you call the function with .delay, and then that task happens in the background and it takes however long it takes to run, and then it stores a result in the database, and then the user could, in theory, access that in the front end. So maybe we'll show you some of that in a later video, but that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this useful. Please put any comments or questions in the comments box below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and also check out our other tutorials on our YouTube channel and also on our website. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.